When Margaret Williams, a 28-year-old housekeeper earning $15 an hour cleaning the marble floors of Thomas Thompson's $12 million Manhattan mansion, threw herself between a charging 120-pound Rottweiler and 6-year-old Jennifer Thompson on that sunny Tuesday afternoon in Central Park West, she had no idea that her split-second decision would reveal a secret she'd been hiding for 8 years and completely transform 2 lives forever. How did a woman who worked 16-hour days scrubbing toilets and washing dishes for one of New York's most arrogant real estate moguls become the most unlikely hero in Manhattan's elite Upper East Side? And why had she been hiding her true identity from the Thompson family since the day she desperately knocked on their door looking for work? This is the story of Margaret Williams, the invisible housekeeper who saved her employer's daughter and proved that the greatest mistake powerful people make is never truly seeing the extraordinary individuals right under their noses, working tirelessly in the shadows of their privileged lives. In just 48 hours, Margaret would go from being treated as worthless help to receiving a check for $200,000 and a job offer that would change her family's destiny forever, showing the world that heroism doesn't wear expensive suits or carry prestigious titles. Thomas Thompson stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, adjusting his Italian silk tie while barking orders into his gold-plated phone. At 45, he commanded Thompson Real Estate Empire, a company worth over $800 million that his grandfather had built from nothing in the 1940s. Thomas had inherited not just the business, but also the family's legendary arrogance and complete disdain for what he called the help. His perfectly styled gray hair, custom Armani suits, and Swiss Rolex Submariner worth more than most people's annual salaries were just the external symbols of a man who believed his wealth made him superior to everyone around him. Thomas had never worked a day of physical labor in his life, never struggled to pay rent, never worried where his next meal would come from. To him, people like housekeepers, gardeners, and drivers were simply invisible fixtures in his world, as replaceable as furniture. "I don't care what excuses they have," Thomas snapped into the phone, his voice carrying the cruel edge that had become his trademark. "If they can't close the Brooklyn deal by Friday, fire the entire team and find people who actually want to work for their money." 30 floors below, in the service entrance of the same building, Margaret Williams was scrubbing blood from her knuckles with cold water and industrial soap. She had been cleaning the Thompson family's penthouse for 8 years, arriving every morning at 5 a.m. and leaving after 10 p.m., 6 days a week. Her small, calloused hands showed the evidence of countless hours spent on her knees scrubbing floors, reaching into tight spaces to dust furniture worth more than her annual salary, and washing dishes that cost more per piece than she made in a month. Margaret was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way that wealth and privilege had trained Thomas Thompson never to notice. Her dark skin bore the gentle lines of someone who smiled despite daily hardships, and her deep brown eyes held an intelligence that 8 years of being treated as invisible had never dimmed. She wore the same faded blue uniform every day, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her presence so understated that the Thompson family often forgot she was in the room when they discussed their private business affairs. What Thomas Thompson didn't know, what none of the wealthy families she had worked for over the years knew, was that Margaret Williams held a master's degree in international business from Columbia University and spoke 4 languages fluently. What they couldn't see beneath her quiet demeanor and cleaning supplies was a woman who had once been on track to become a corporate executive, who had scored in the top 5% on her graduate school entrance exams, who had been offered internships at prestigious Manhattan investment firms. But life had other plans for Margaret Williams. 8 years ago, her younger sister had been killed in a car accident, leaving behind twin boys who were only 3 years old at the time. Margaret had been weeks away from starting her dream job at a major consulting firm when she received the call that changed everything. Without hesitation, she had turned down the $60,000 starting salary to take custody of her nephews, Marcus and Michael, becoming their legal guardian overnight. The consulting firm couldn't wait. The dream job disappeared. Her savings ran out within months as she struggled to care for two traumatized toddlers while searching for work that would pay enough to support them. Desperately, she had started taking housekeeping jobs because they were the only positions that offered immediate payment and flexible hours that allowed her to be home with the boys in the evenings. Every morning for 8 years, Margaret Williams had walked into Thomas Thompson's penthouse and been treated like she was worth less than the marble floors she polished. She endured his casual cruelty, his wife's condescending comments, and their assumption that she was uneducated and unintelligent. She bit her tongue when Thomas complained about paying her $15 an hour, knowing that he spent more on a single lunch than she made in an entire week. But she needed the job. Marcus and Michael, now 11 years old, were brilliant students who deserved every opportunity she could give them. Every insult she swallowed, every demeaning comment she ignored, every day she spent invisible in the Thompson house was an investment in their future. She was saving every penny she could for their college educations, working 16-hour days so that they would never have to choose between their dreams and their family the way she had. On that Tuesday afternoon, Margaret was in the Thompsons' kitchen, preparing dinner for the family while 6-year-old Jennifer Thompson played in the private garden just outside the penthouse terrace. Jennifer was the one member of the Thompson family who had always seen Margaret as a real person. The little girl would often sit in the kitchen while Margaret worked, asking questions about her life, sharing stories from school, treating her with the natural kindness that children possess before the world teaches them otherwise. "Margaret," Jennifer had said earlier that day, her small voice serious as she watched Margaret arrange fresh flowers in a crystal vase. "Why does Daddy always talk to you like you're stupid? You know more words than anyone I know." Margaret had smiled gently, her heart breaking a little at the child's innocent observation. "Sometimes, honey, people see what they expect to see instead of what's really there." Thomas Thompson was in his home office, screaming at his lawyers over a deal that was falling apart. His voice carried through the penthouse as he berated everyone involved, threatening to sue, to fire, to destroy careers over what he considered their incompetence. His wife, Patricia, was at her yoga class, probably complaining to other wealthy wives about how hard it was to find good help these days. Margaret was stirring a pot of homemade soup, the recipe her sister had taught her years ago, when she heard Jennifer's scream pierce the air. The sound hit Margaret like electricity. She dropped the wooden spoon and ran toward the terrace, her heart pounding as she pushed through the sliding glass doors. What she saw made her blood freeze. A massive Rottweiler, at least 120 pounds of muscle and fury, had somehow gotten into the private garden. The dog was backing Jennifer against the stone wall, its lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth like daggers. The animal was clearly agitated, possibly injured or frightened, its eyes wild and unpredictable. Jennifer was pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face, too terrified to move or make a sound. Margaret didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She didn't consider her own safety or stop to call for help. In that moment, every instinct she possessed focused on one thing: protecting that little girl. She grabbed a heavy ceramic planter from the terrace table and sprinted toward the dog, placing herself directly between the Rottweiler and Jennifer. The animal immediately turned its attention to her, sensing a new threat. Margaret made herself as large as possible, raising the planter above her head while speaking in a firm, authoritative voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "Back! Get back!" she commanded, her voice carrying an unexpected power that made even the enraged animal pause for a moment. But the Rottweiler was beyond reasoning. It lunged. Margaret swung the ceramic planter with every ounce of strength she possessed, connecting with the side of the dog's head, just as its jaws snapped shut inches from her throat. The impact sent both Margaret and the dog tumbling to the ground, ceramic fragments scattering across the garden stones. The Rottweiler recovered quickly, shaking its massive head and preparing to attack again. Margaret rolled away, her hands and arms already bleeding from the ceramic shards, positioning herself once again between the dog and Jennifer. That's when Thomas Thompson burst through the terrace doors. He had heard his daughter's scream and Margaret's shouts from his office. What he saw when he reached the garden would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. his 6-year-old daughter cowering against the wall, while his housekeeper, bleeding and battered, stood facing down a massive attack dog with nothing but her bare hands and unshakable determination. "Jennifer!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with terror he had never experienced before. The sound of her father's voice seemed to snap Jennifer out of her paralysis. She ran toward him, but her movement triggered the Rottweiler's prey drive. The animal spun around and charged toward the running child. Margaret Williams, bleeding and exhausted, made a decision that would change everything. She threw herself directly into the path of the charging dog, absorbing the full impact of 120 pounds of muscle and fury. The Rottweiler's momentum carried both of them across the garden, Margaret's body serving as a shield that prevented the animal from reaching Jennifer. They hit the stone wall hard. Margaret felt ribs crack, felt her shoulder pop out of joint, felt teeth sink into her arm as she wrapped it around the dog's neck to prevent it from turning toward Jennifer. But she held on. Through the pain, through the fear, through the certainty that she might die in this garden, she held on. Thomas Thompson watched in stunned amazement as his housekeeper, the woman he had never truly seen as a person, wrestled with a monster to save his daughter's life. He grabbed the heavy wrought iron garden hose and brought it down across the Rottweiler's back with all his strength. The combination of the blow and Margaret's relentless grip finally subdued the animal enough for Thomas to pull his daughter to safety and call 911. When the paramedics arrived, they found Margaret Williams unconscious in the garden, her body covering the spot where Jennifer had been standing, her arms still positioned as if she was protecting something precious. Her uniform was torn and bloody, her face pale from blood loss, but she was alive. As they loaded Margaret into the ambulance, Jennifer Thompson broke away from her father and ran to the stretcher. "Margaret!" she cried, grabbing the woman's hand. "You saved me! You saved me!" Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and despite the pain medication, despite the broken ribs and dislocated shoulder, despite everything that had just happened, she smiled at the little girl. "You're safe, honey," she whispered. "That's all that matters." Thomas Thompson stood in the hospital waiting room at Mount Sinai, still wearing his expensive suit but looking more disheveled than he had ever appeared in his adult life. His perfectly styled hair was messy, his Italian leather shoes were scuffed, and his hands were shaking as he tried to process what he had witnessed. For the first time in his 45 years of life, Thomas Thompson was confronting the reality that he had been wrong about something fundamental. He had spent 8 years treating Margaret Williams like she was invisible, like she was worth less than the furniture in his home. He had assumed she was uneducated, unintelligent, replaceable. But what he had seen in that garden was something that no amount of money could buy. True courage, selfless heroism, and a moral character that he was beginning to realize he himself had never possessed. When the doctor finally emerged from the emergency room, Thomas jumped to his feet. "How is she?" he asked, surprised by the genuine concern in his own voice. "She's stable," the doctor replied. 3 broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, significant lacerations on her arms and hands. She'll need surgery to repair some of the muscle damage, but she'll make a full recovery. Mr. Thompson, I have to tell you, what that woman did was extraordinary. She could have been killed." Thomas nodded, unable to find words that seemed adequate. "She's asking about your daughter," the doctor continued. Even with her injuries, her first concern was making sure the child was unharmed. "She's fine," Thomas said quietly, "thanks to Margaret." Later that evening, Thomas Thompson did something he had never done before. He sat by Margaret Williams's hospital bed, waiting for her to wake up. When her eyes finally opened, she seemed surprised to see him there. "Mr. Thompson," she said weakly, "is Jennifer okay? Is she hurt?" "She's perfect," Thomas said, his voice softer than Margaret had ever heard it. "Because of you." Margaret tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "I need to get back to work," she said. "I have responsibilities." "Margaret," Thomas said, and for the first time in 8 years, he said her name like she was a real person. "You're not going anywhere until you're completely healed. And when you do come back, things are going to be different." "Sir?" Thomas Thompson looked at this woman, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. He saw the intelligence in her eyes that he had been too arrogant to notice. He saw the strength of character that had always been there, waiting for him to pay attention. He saw someone who had risked everything to save what mattered most to him. "I owe you my daughter's life," he said simply. "And I owe you an apology for 8 years of treating you like you didn't matter." Margaret didn't know what to say. In all her years of working for wealthy families, she had never heard an employer apologize for anything. "Mr. Thompson, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. What did you do before you started working as a housekeeper?" For 8 years, Margaret had been invisible. For 8 years, she had bitten her tongue and accepted being treated as less than human. For 8 years, she had hidden her intelligence, her education, her dreams behind a uniform and a mop bucket. But sitting in that hospital bed, looking at Thomas Thompson's face and seeing something she had never seen before, genuine respect, Margaret Williams decided it was time to stop being invisible. "I have a master's degree in international business from Columbia University," she said quietly. "I graduated summa cum laude. I was going to work for McKinsey & Company, but my sister died, and I became guardian to her twin sons. I needed work immediately, and housekeeping was the only job that would pay me right away." Thomas Thompson stared at her in stunned silence. "You have a master's degree from Columbia?" "Yes, sir." "You were going to work for McKinsey?" "Yes, sir." Thomas felt something he had never experienced before. Shame. Deep, burning shame for how he had treated someone who was not just his equal, but possibly his superior in both character and education. "Margaret," he said slowly, "what are your sons' names?" "Marcus and Michael. They're 11 now. They're honor roll students. They want to be doctors." Thomas Thompson, who had built his fortune by recognizing opportunity and acting quickly, made a decision that would change multiple lives. "Margaret, when you're released from this hospital, you're not coming back as my housekeeper." Margaret's heart sank. After everything, was he firing her? "Sir, please, I need this job. I have to support my nephews. I'll work harder, I promise." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're not coming back as my housekeeper because I'm offering you a position as Vice President of Business Development at Thompson Real Estate Empire. Starting salary, $150,000 a year, plus performance bonuses. Full medical benefits for you and your sons. College scholarship fund for both boys. Full ride to any university they can get into." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Mr. Thompson, I don't understand." "Margaret, you saved my daughter's life. But more than that, you've been invisible in my house for 8 years, listening to every business call I've made, every strategy session I've held, every deal I've discussed. You probably know more about my business than half my executives do. If you're half as intelligent as your Columbia degree suggests, and if you have half the character you showed in that garden, then you're exactly what my company needs. But sir, I haven't worked in business for 8 years. "Margaret," Thomas said, leaning forward, "you've been working in business for 8 years. You just haven't been getting paid what you're worth." 3 months later, Margaret Williams walked into the 42nd floor conference room at Thompson Real Estate Empire, wearing a tailored business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The executives around the table looked up as Thomas Thompson introduced the company's newest vice president. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Margaret Williams, our new VP of Business Development. Margaret has a master's in international business from Columbia and will be overseeing our expansion into the Brooklyn market." What Thomas didn't tell them was that Margaret had already identified 3 major flaws in their Brooklyn strategy and had prepared a presentation that would save the company over $50 million in the first year alone. As Margaret took her seat at the conference table, she thought about Marcus and Michael, who were now attending one of Manhattan's most prestigious private schools on full scholarship, their college futures secure. She thought about the small apartment they had finally been able to leave, moving into a beautiful home in a safe neighborhood where her boys could play outside without fear. But mostly, she thought about how sometimes the most powerful people in the world need to be reminded that heroism doesn't come with a price tag, that intelligence doesn't require expensive clothes, and that the most extraordinary people are often the ones they never bothered to really see. 6 months later, Margaret Williams was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as one of New York's most innovative business executives. The article detailed her rapid rise from housekeeper to corporate executive and her groundbreaking work in affordable housing development. But the moment that mattered most to Margaret came when Jennifer Thompson, now 7 years old and still Margaret's biggest fan, ran up to her in the Thompson family's new, more modest home and wrapped her arms around her waist. "Margaret," the little girl said, looking up with bright eyes. "Daddy says you're the smartest person he knows now." Margaret smiled, remembering the scared, invisible woman who had scrubbed floors for 8 years while hiding her dreams. "You know what, honey?" Margaret said, kneeling down to Jennifer's level. "I think I always was. It just took the right moment for everyone else to see it." Thomas Thompson, watching from across the room, nodded in agreement. He had learned the most valuable lesson of his life from a woman he had almost overlooked completely. That true worth has nothing to do with how much money someone has or where they came from, and everything to do with who they choose to be when it matters most. The Rottweiler, they later learned, had escaped from a neighbor's yard after being startled by construction noise. It was put in quarantine and later returned to its owners, who installed a higher fence and enrolled it in behavioral training. But the real story wasn't about the dog or the attack or even the rescue. The real story was about Margaret Williams, the invisible hero who proved that sometimes the most extraordinary people are working right under our noses, waiting for someone to give them a chance to shine. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage to change everything. Thomas Thompson never forgot what he learned that day, that the most dangerous assumption wealthy people make is believing that money makes them better than everyone else, when the truth is that character, courage, and intelligence can't be bought at any price. Margaret Williams became one of the most successful executives in New York real estate, but she never forgot where she came from or the years she spent invisible. She started a scholarship fund for single parents pursuing higher education and personally mentored dozens of women who were working multiple jobs to support their families while chasing their dreams. Marcus and Michael Williams graduated from Harvard and Yale respectively, both becoming doctors as they had dreamed, both carrying forward their aunt's legacy of quiet strength and determination. And Jennifer Thompson grew up knowing that heroes don't always wear capes or arrive with sirens blaring. Sometimes they wear cleaning uniforms and carry mop buckets, and they're willing to sacrifice everything to protect what matters most. The greatest heroes, she learned, are often the people we see every day, but never really notice, until the moment they step forward and change our lives forever. In the end, Margaret Williams taught an entire family, and eventually an entire city, that being invisible doesn't mean being worthless, that being overlooked doesn't mean being ordinary, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay hidden when someone needs you to be brave. She proved that heroism isn't about having superpowers or special training. It's about having the courage to act when action is needed, the strength to sacrifice for others, and the wisdom to know that every life has value, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Margaret Williams stopped being invisible the day she chose to be seen. And in doing so, she reminded everyone around her that the most extraordinary people are often the ones we never bothered to really look at in the first place. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more incredible true stories of everyday heroes who changed lives through courage, determination, and the power of never giving up on what's right.